The scream that shattered the morning calm at Ashworth Park was not the joyous cry of a bride on her wedding day, but something altogether more sinister. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper whose composure had weathered 30 years of aristocratic crises, stood frozen in the doorway of the blue suite, her face drained of all color as she stared at the impossible scene before her. The bridal chamber, which only hours before had been a symphony of white silk and orange blossoms, now presented a tableau that defied all rational explanation. Lady Vivian Ashworth's wedding gown lay spread across the four-poster bed with ceremonial precision, as if she had simply vanished from within its delicate embrace. The French doors leading to the private balcony stood slightly ajar, their gossamer curtains dancing in the September breeze like ghostly fingers beckoning toward some unseen mystery. But it was not the abandoned dress that had wrung that terrible cry from Mrs. Pemberton's throat. It was the sight of the Ashworth emeralds, the family's most precious heirloom, worth more than most estates, scattered across the Persian carpet like fallen tears, their settings empty, the stones themselves nowhere to be found. The gathering storm. Within the hour, the great drawing-room of Ashworth Park had transformed from a place of pre-wedding celebration into something resembling a court of inquiry. The wedding guests, who had arrived expecting champagne and congratulations, now found themselves reluctant witnesses to an inexplicable disappearance. The morning sun, which should have illuminated a bride's radiant face, instead cast long shadows across a room filled with bewildered faces and whispered speculation. Lord Edmund Ashworth, the groom whose happiness had evaporated with the dawn, sat rigidly in his ancestral chair, his military bearing the only thing preventing complete collapse. His hands, which had trembled with anticipation while adjusting his cufflinks that morning, now lay perfectly still, too still, as if he dared not trust them to move. There must be some explanation, he repeated for the dozenth time, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man trying to convince himself as much as others. Vivienne would never, she could never simply disappear. Not today. Not like this. His younger brother, Captain James Ashworth, recently returned from service in India, with a reputation for cool thinking under fire, paced behind the settee where their mother, the formidable Dowager Lady Ashworth, maintained her dignity through sheer force of will. The captain's weathered features betrayed none of the confusion that plagued the others. Instead, his sharp eyes moved constantly about the room, cataloguing details with the precision of a man trained in reconnaissance. Near the tall windows overlooking the rose garden, Lady Vivian's closest friend, Miss Cordelia Fairfax, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while her companion, the sharp-tongued Mrs. Helena Blackwood, stood sentinel beside her. Mrs. Blackwood, whose reputation for social observation was matched only by her talent for social destruction, had maintained an unusual silence since the discovery, a fact that had not escaped the notice of those who knew her well. The bride's guardian, Colonel Sir Reginald Pemberton, a man whose distinguished military career had prepared him for many crises, but not this particular variety, consulted his pocket watch with increasing frequency, as if the passage of time might somehow restore order to the morning's chaos. The impossible room, Inspector Bradshaw of the local constabulary, a competent man whose experience extended primarily to petty theft and the occasional poaching incident, found himself thoroughly out of his depth as he examined the blue suite for the third time. The room presented a puzzle that seemed to mock the very foundations of logical investigation. The door had been locked from the inside. Mrs. Pemberton's master key had been required to gain entry. The windows, while open, were situated on the second floor with no convenient means of descent save a sheer drop to the flagstone terrace below. The chimney was far too narrow for human passage, and the walls showed no signs of secret panels or hidden passages, despite the house's considerable age. Yet somehow, Lady Vivian Ashworth had vanished as completely as if she had been spirited away by supernatural forces, leaving behind only her wedding dress, the scattered emerald settings, and a mystery that grew more perplexing with each passing moment. Enter Hercule Poirot. It was precisely at this moment of maximum bewilderment that fate, in the form of a broken-down motor car on the main road to London, delivered an unexpected solution to Inspector Bradshaw's predicament. The small egg-shaped man who appeared at the front door of Ashworth Park, immaculately dressed despite his automotive misfortune, introduced himself with a slight bow and a carefully waxed mustache that seemed to twitch with professional interest. "I am Hercule Poirot," he announced to the harried butler, his accent lending a musical quality to the words. "I find myself in need of mechanical assistance, but perhaps, if I may be so bold, I might be of some small service in return." The name meant nothing to most of those assembled in the drawing-room, but Inspector Bradshaw's face brightened considerably as he recognized the reputation that had preceded the small Belgian detective even to this quiet corner of the English countryside. "Monsieur Poirot," the inspector said with evident relief, "your arrival is most fortuitous. We have here a case that defies all conventional explanation." Poirot's dark eyes, bright with intelligence, swept the room with the methodical precision of a man who missed nothing of importance. He noted the way Lord Edmund's hands remained too carefully controlled, the manner in which Mrs. Blackwood's sharp gaze avoided direct contact with his own, and the almost imperceptible tension that seemed to radiate from Captain Ashworth despite his military composure. "Ah," Poirot murmured, settling himself in the chair offered by the Dowager Lady Ashworth with the deliberate care of a man who approached every situation as a chess problem waiting to be solved. A bride who vanishes from a locked room, leaving behind her wedding dress and, I am told, some rather valuable jewelry. Most intriguing indeed. He paused, his fingers steepled before him, and fixed each member of the assembled company with a gaze that seemed to penetrate directly to the soul. "But before we proceed with theories and speculation," he continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute confidence, "perhaps someone would be so kind as to explain to Poirot exactly what has occurred here this morning, for I suspect that in the telling of this tale we shall find not one mystery, but several, and each more fascinating than the last." The game, as those familiar with Hercule Poirot's methods knew well, had officially Poirot declined Inspector Bradshaw's offer of refreshment with a polite wave of his small, perfectly manicured hand. "First, mon ami, we must listen to what the scene itself wishes to tell us. The Blue Suite, she has been waiting patiently to share her secrets." The room's silent testimony. The Blue Suite presented itself to Poirot's methodical examination like a stage set, frozen at the moment of catastrophe. He moved with deliberate precision, his dark eyes cataloguing every detail that conventional investigation had overlooked. The wedding gown, spread across the four-poster bed with almost ceremonial care, drew his immediate attention. "Observe, Inspector," Poirot murmured, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat. "This dress has been removed not in haste, but with considerable deliberation. See how the sleeves are positioned just so, the train arranged to avoid creasing. A bride fleeing in panic does not pause to fold her wedding gown with the precision of a lady's maid." He knelt beside the scattered emerald settings, examining them through his glass with the intensity of a jeweler appraising precious stones. And here, another curiosity. These settings have been opened not with crude force, but with delicate expertise. The prongs are bent with minimal damage. This is the work of someone who understands the value of preservation. Captain James Ashworth, who had followed them upstairs despite protocol, watched with professional interest. "You're suggesting the stones were removed deliberately?" "I suggest nothing yet, mon capitaine. But your service in India, it would have brought you into contact with precious stones, perhaps?" Poirot's casual question carried the weight of deeper inquiry. A barely perceptible tightening around the captain's eyes suggested the observation had struck home. "One encounters many things in the East, Monsieur Poirot." Moving to the French doors, Poirot examined the delicate latch mechanism with scientific precision. The doors stood slightly ajar, their gossamer curtains dancing in the morning breeze, except for the right curtain, which was caught deliberately behind a small side table. "Most interesting," he observed. Someone disliked disorder more than they enjoyed fresh air. This suggests a meticulous personality, or someone wishing to appear meticulous. He stepped onto the balcony, his hands gripping the stone balustrade as he studied not the 20-foot drop below, but the elaborate stonework of the building's facade. His gaze lingered on an ornate gargoyle jutting from the wall some 6 feet to the left. The human element. Returning to the drawing room, Poirot settled into his chosen chair with the air of a conductor preparing to direct an orchestra. His interviews began with Lord Edmund, whose military bearing could not entirely mask the tremor in his hands when he spoke of his missing bride. "The Ashworth emeralds were to be worn today," Poirot inquired gently. "A family tradition," Edmund replied, his voice carefully controlled. "But they are merely baubles compared to Vivian's safety." The slight over-eagerness to dismiss the jewels did not escape Poirot's notice. Captain James proved more guarded in his responses, his answers delivered with military precision. When questioned about the emeralds, he observed, "One would think a woman fleeing would take her most valuable assets with her, not scatter them like discarded crumbs." Miss Cordelia Fairfax, still tearful, insisted through her distress that Vivian had been genuinely happy. "She showed me her dress last night, her eyes sparkling with joy." Yet when Poirot pressed gently about confidences shared between friends, Cordelia's gaze flickered away uncertainly. Mrs. Helena Blackwood, sharp-tongued as her reputation suggested, offered a more cynical perspective. "Perhaps a sudden change of heart, Monsieur Poirot, or a more advantageous offer." Her eyes never quite met his, flitting about the room with calculating assessment. The Dowager Lady Ashworth received Poirot with formidable dignity, though he noticed the almost imperceptible clenching of her gloved hands when she spoke of disgruntled former suitors. Colonel Pemberton, Vivian's guardian, blustered about scandal and family honor, but his focus on reputation rather than the missing woman herself spoke volumes. Initial deductions. As the interviews concluded, Poirot returned once more to the Blue Suite, standing motionless in its center like a chess master contemplating his next move. The physical impossibility of the locked room was merely the frame. The true picture lay in the human hearts he had just examined, each harboring secrets that might explain both a bride's disappearance and her fortune in missing emeralds. "Inspector," he said finally, his voice carrying quiet authority, "we must obtain a list of all who possess master keys to this house and inquire discreetly about any foreign correspondence received yesterday. Also," he added with a slight smile, "we must locate a missing shoe. There is a bride somewhere with only one slipper. Or perhaps no bride at all." The game had begun in earnest, and Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were already working to unravel the carefully constructed deception that masqueraded as an impossible crime. Begun. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Ashworth Park cast an investigative pallor over the proceedings as Poirot began his systematic examination of those who had served the vanished bride. His approach was methodical, each interview building upon the last like stones in a carefully constructed wall of evidence. The servant's silent knowledge. Ethel Marsh, Lady Vivian's personal maid, entered the morning room with the nervous precision of one whose livelihood depended upon discretion. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her black dress, but her testimony proved invaluable to Poirot's growing understanding of the mystery. "Last evening, monsieur, I laid out the wedding gown and prepared everything according to her ladyship's particular instructions," Ethel began, her voice barely above a whisper. She was most specific about the arrangement. The dress must lie just so, the shoes positioned precisely. She dismissed me early, saying she wished to attend to some final details herself. Poirot's dark eyes sharpened with interest. "These details, mademoiselle. Did they involve correspondence, perhaps? A letter arrived by special messenger at 11:15, sir. Dark sealing wax with a foreign crest. Her ladyship seemed startled when she received it. She asked for her writing materials immediately after. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, provided additional crucial details with the methodical precision that had served the household for 3 decades. I secured the blue suite personally at 11 o'clock, Monsieur Poirot. The door was locked, and Lady Vivian answered when I called through. This morning I used my master key at precisely 8:05. The room was exactly as we found it, impossible as it seems. When questioned about the ornate mantel clock in the blue suite, Mrs. Pemberton confirmed Poirot's observation. "The clock runs 8 minutes slow, sir. It has done so for years." Lady Vivian mentioned it kept her awake with its ticking. Jarvis, the butler, contributed the foreign correspondence angle that would prove significant. "There was indeed a letter with a Vienna postmark last fortnight, sir. Lord Edmund took it to the library. And yesterday's letter. The sealing wax bore a Parisian crest, though I cannot say more than that." Mrs. Blackwood's sharp observations. Poirot's private interview with Mrs. Helena Blackwood in the conservatory proved particularly illuminating. The sharp-tongued woman had observed details that others had missed or chosen to ignore. "Monsieur Poirot, I witnessed what appeared to be a heated discussion between Lady Vivian and Captain James yesterday evening," she revealed with the satisfaction of one holding valuable cards. "They spoke near the library in hushed but urgent tones. The captain seemed to be pleading with her about something, most unlike his usual composed demeanor. More significantly, Mrs. Blackwood had observed the arrival and impact of the mysterious correspondence. A telegram came for Lady Vivian yesterday afternoon from a Philippe Dubois in Paris. Her reaction was quite dramatic. She went pale, read it twice, then immediately composed a lengthy response which she insisted on delivering to the telegraph office personally. The name Philippe Dubois hung in the air like an unexplained shadow, adding another layer to the growing complexity of Lady Vivian's disappearance. Physical evidence in the gardens. Poirot's examination of the grounds beneath the blue suite yielded unexpected discoveries. A single thread of white silk caught on a rose thorn 10 feet from the building suggested the bride had indeed passed that way, yet the physical impossibility of the locked room remained. More intriguingly, a small scratch on the ornate gargoyle jutting from the wall indicated recent contact with something, or someone. The discovery of one white satin wedding slipper caught in the branches of an ancient oak tree 15 feet above ground added another impossible element to the puzzle. The shoe showed no signs of outdoor wear, no scuff marks or soil, suggesting it had been placed rather than lost in flight. The convenient culprit. Inspector Bradshaw's relief was palpable when a scullery maid was found with 2 raw emeralds in her possession. "There's our thief, Monsieur Poirot," he announced with satisfaction. Simple theft that escalated when the bride discovered her. But Poirot's response was measured and skeptical. The wedding gown, so carefully arranged. Does a panicked thief take such pains? And these raw emeralds, Inspector, while the settings on the carpet clearly held mounted stones? The little grey cells, they suggest this is merely a curtain drawn across a far more intricate stage. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Ashworth Park, Hercule Poirot found himself with a collection of seemingly impossible clues. A bride who vanished from a locked room, foreign correspondence that disturbed her greatly, a missing grey velvet cloak, and physical evidence that defied logical explanation. The game was growing more complex with each revelation, and somewhere among the assembled suspects, a clever mind was watching Poirot's every move. The afternoon brought what Inspector Bradshaw considered a most satisfactory resolution to the morning's mysteries. He entered the drawing-room of Ashworth Park with the unmistakable bearing of a man who believed he had untangled the Gordian knot with a single decisive stroke. The convenient solution. "Excellent news, Monsieur Poirot. Bradshaw announced, his chest swelling with professional pride. "The case is solved. We have apprehended the culprit and recovered some of the stolen property." Poirot, who had been arranging sugar cubes into a perfect geometric pattern on a small side table, paused with one cube suspended between his thumb and forefinger. His dark eyes regarded the inspector with the patient attention of a professor awaiting a student's recitation. "Indeed, Inspector. And who, pray tell, is this remarkably efficient criminal?" "Annie Blake, one of the scullery maids. She was discovered with 2 emeralds in her possession, hidden in her quarters. She's confessed to the theft." Bradshaw's satisfaction was palpable. A simple case of servant's greed that escalated when the bride discovered her in the act. Poirot carefully placed the final sugar cube, completing his architectural creation. "A simple theft, you say? And Lady Vivian, Inspector, has she too been recovered from this maid's quarters?" The inspector's confidence wavered slightly. "Well, no, not yet, but clearly the girl panicked when confronted. The bride must have fled, or perhaps—" He left the darker implication unspoken. "Ah, the logic of convenience," Poirot murmured, his voice carrying the gentle reproach of a disappointed teacher. "Tell me, Inspector, did this Annie also possess the remarkable ability to dematerialize from a locked room? And did she, a scullery maid, arrange that wedding gown with the precision of a museum curator before making her escape?" The systematic dismantling. Poirot's methodical destruction of the hasty conclusion was a masterpiece of logical reasoning. He led Inspector Bradshaw through each impossibility with the patience of a man who understood that truth emerged not from convenient assumptions, but from the careful examination of contradictions. "The emeralds discovered in the maid's possession, Inspector, were they the mounted stones from the Ashworth family settings? Or were they, perhaps, raw stones that bear no resemblance to the carefully crafted jewelry that has adorned Ashworth brides for generations?" Bradshaw shifted uncomfortably. "They were uncut stones, raw emeralds. Annie claims she found them in the garden." "Indeed. And the empty settings scattered across the blue suite carpet, these held mounted stones, carefully removed by someone with considerable expertise. Are we to believe that a frightened scullery maid possessed both the skill to dismantle antique jewelry and the foresight to plant different stones upon herself as evidence?" Poirot's voice remained conversational, but each word chipped away at the inspector's convenient theory. "The little grey cells, mon ami, they protest most vigorously against such a narrative." The maid's truth. Poirot insisted upon interviewing Annie Blake personally. The girl, barely out of her teens and trembling with terror, presented a picture of innocence that even the most hardened investigator could not mistake for criminal cunning. Her story was heartbreakingly simple. While clearing brush near the old oak tree the previous afternoon, she had discovered 2 small, rough green stones. Believing them to be valuable, she had hidden them away, intending to sell them in the village to help her ailing mother. Her confession to stealing the emeralds was born of fear and confusion, not actual guilt regarding Lady Vivian's disappearance. "I never been in the blue suite, sir," she whispered to Poirot, her eyes wide with genuine terror. "I wouldn't dare. Mrs. Pemberton would have my position, and my mother, she needs the medicine money." When Poirot gently questioned her about the wedding slipper found in the oak tree, her bewilderment was absolute. "A slipper, monsieur. I saw nothing of the sort. Just them green stones glinting in the leaves." Deeper investigations. With the false solution dismissed, Poirot turned his attention to the more complex psychological landscape that surrounded Lady Vivian's disappearance. His subsequent interviews revealed layers of deception that made Annie Blake's simple theft seem like child's play. Lord Edmund, when pressed about his financial circumstances, finally admitted to substantial debts incurred through unfortunate investments in post-war reconstruction projects. "The Vienna correspondence concerns my creditors, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing more sinister than a gentleman's struggle to maintain his obligations." Yet Poirot's sharp eyes noted the Turkish cigarette stub in the library ashtray, a detail that connected to Captain James's known preferences for exotic tobacco. When questioned, the captain's military composure cracked slightly. "I did speak with Vivian yesterday evening," he admitted, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "She was distressed about something, a letter she had received. She spoke of feeling trapped, of obligations that conflicted with her heart's desires." The grey velvet mystery? Mrs. Pemberton's inventory of the blue suite had revealed another crucial detail. Lady Vivian's grey velvet travelling cloak was missing from its customary place in the wardrobe. This seemingly minor absence took on greater significance when combined with Annie Blake's description of the mysterious figure who had pressed the emeralds into her hand. Someone in a long cloak, velvet-like. "Grey," the maid had said. The voice was muffled. Could have been a lady, could have been. She had trailed off, unable to complete the thought. The balcony experiment. As evening shadows lengthened across Ashworth Park, Poirot conducted what he termed a simple experiment in the blue suite. He positioned each member of the household upon the balcony in turn, observing their reactions to the 20-foot drop, their familiarity with the ornate stonework, and their natural movements around the space. Most revealing was the way Lord Edmund automatically adjusted the gossamer curtains to their precise position when he re-entered the room, restoring the deliberate symmetry without conscious thought. Captain James, meanwhile, found the toe hold on the carved gargoyle with the ease of someone who had discovered it before. During this experiment, Poirot's keen eyes spotted something that everyone else had missed: a small steel hairpin, slightly bent at the tip, lying beneath the Persian carpet's fringe. The collective intake of breath when he displayed this seemingly insignificant object told him that at least one person recognized its importance. The psychological web. As the assembled company dispersed, each lost in their own thoughts and fears, Poirot remained alone in the blue suite. The room seemed to whisper its secrets to him: the meticulously arranged wedding gown, the precisely positioned curtains, the 8-minute discrepancy of the mantel clock that had been mentioned as keeping Lady Vivian awake. "Order," he murmured to the empty room, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. Always the passion for order. It reveals so much about the human heart, and sometimes it reveals everything about the criminal mind. The false lead had been dismissed, but in its dismissal, Poirot had uncovered a web of psychological complexity that made Annie Blake's simple theft seem like a mere distraction from the true crime. Somewhere among the assembled suspects, a clever mind was watching his every move, confident in their elaborate deception, unaware that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were already beginning to perceive the pattern hidden beneath the chaos of clues and contradictions. The game, as Poirot well knew, was far from over. Indeed, it had only just begun to reveal its true compole. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the drawing room of Ashworth Park as Poirot arranged what appeared to be a simple social gathering. His request that the household join him for tea seemed innocent enough, yet those who knew the Belgian detective's methods might have recognized the careful orchestration behind his seemingly casual invitation. The art of observation. "You will perhaps indulge an old man's peculiar habits," Poirot said as the company assembled, his voice carrying that deceptive mildness that often preceded his most penetrating insights. "I find that people reveal themselves most clearly in the small unconscious actions. The way one stirs sugar, the manner of holding a teacup, the precise moment when one chooses to drink." The instruction seemed harmless, even quaint, yet it had the effect of making everyone acutely conscious of their movements. Lord Edmund's military precision emerged in his methodical stirring, exactly 3 clockwise rotations before setting the spoon parallel to the saucer's edge. Captain James declined sugar entirely, drinking his tea with the efficient dispatch of a man accustomed to field conditions where leisure was a luxury. Miss Cordelia Fairfax's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup, while Mrs. Blackwood fussed with unnecessary adjustments to her spoon's placement, betraying an anxiety that her sharp tongue usually concealed. The Dowager Lady Ashworth drank without ceremony, as if tea were merely another duty to be discharged with appropriate dignity. Most revealing of all was Colonel Pemberton, who spilled a single drop and muttered an oath under his breath, the reaction of a man whose nerves were stretched tighter than he cared to admit. The hairpin's tale. With the psychological groundwork laid, Poirot produced the bent steel hairpin with the flourish of a magician, revealing his chosen card. This small object was discovered beneath the Persian carpet in the blue suite. To most, it would seem insignificant, a mere trifle, easily overlooked. He held it to the light, examining the slight but deliberate bend in its shaft. Yet observe, mes amis, how it has been shaped, not by accident, but by purpose. This is the mark of pressure applied with specific intent. When he summoned Ethel Marsh to examine the hairpin, her identification proved illuminating. This is not Lady Vivian's, monsieur. She preferred gold or tortoiseshell pins. This is the common sort, steel, inexpensive. I use them myself when my better pins are being cleaned. And have you, mademoiselle, ever used such a pin for purposes other than arranging hair? The maid's blush was answer enough. Sometimes, sir, when a lock is stiff or the key won't turn properly, one might encourage it a little. Poirot's smile was gentle but significant. Indeed, the art of persuading reluctant mechanisms to yield their secrets. Most educational. The clock's deception. Returning to the blue suite, Poirot focused his attention on the mantel clock that had run 8 minutes slow for years. A detail that Lady Vivian had mentioned kept her awake with its persistent ticking. His examination of the timepiece revealed fresh fingerprints on the winding mechanism, evidence that someone had recently manipulated it. But not to correct its timing, he murmured to Inspector Bradshaw, who had accompanied him. Rather to ensure its continued inaccuracy, someone wished to maintain this 8-minute discrepancy for their own purposes. The implications were staggering. If the clock had been deliberately kept slow, then the entire timeline of Lady Vivian's disappearance might be false. Mrs. Pemberton's testimony that she had secured the room at 11 o'clock would mean the actual time was 11:08, 8 crucial minutes that could account for actions that seemed impossible within the established time frame. Pressure applied. Armed with these insights, Poirot began applying subtle psychological pressure to each suspect, watching for the telltale reactions that would reveal guilt or complicity. His approach was masterfully indirect, couching accusations within seemingly innocent observations. To Captain James, he remarked, "The balcony of the Blue Suite offers an excellent view of the Rose Garden." A man with military training would naturally assess such vantage points, perhaps even test their accessibility during late-night contemplations with a Turkish cigarette. The captain's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. One develops habits of observation in service, Monsieur Poirot. Indeed, and habits of action, when circumstances require decisive measures. With Lord Edmund, Poirot's approach was more oblique. The Ashworth emeralds represent more than mere monetary value, do they not? They are symbols of continuity, of promises made and kept. Their removal would be significant to someone who valued such symbolism. The stones themselves matter little compared to Vivienne's safety, Edmund replied, but his emphasis on dismissing their importance struck Poirot as slightly forced. The study's secret. The discovery of Lord Edmund's ransacked study provided another piece of the puzzle, though not in the way Inspector Bradshaw initially assumed. The chaos was too deliberate, too theatrical, the work of someone creating an impression rather than genuinely searching for something. "Observe, Inspector," Poirot noted, examining the scattered papers with his magnifying glass. The drawers have been pulled out, yes, but their contents remain largely organized. The books are displaced but not damaged. This is not the work of a desperate searcher, but of someone wishing to create the appearance of desperate searching. More significantly, a small antique pistol, a family heirloom, was missing from its display case. The theft seemed almost incidental, as if the weapon had been taken not for its own sake, but to complete some larger design. The web revealed. As evening approached, Poirot gathered the household once more, his manner suggesting that the game was entering its final phase. The psychological pressure he had applied throughout the day had begun to show results. Subtle cracks in carefully maintained facades, nervous glances exchanged when they thought he wasn't watching, the gradual erosion of alibis that had seemed unshakable that morning. "The locked room," he announced, his voice carrying quiet authority, "is not the mystery we have been led to believe. It is, rather, an elaborate stage setting designed to conceal a far simpler truth. The impossible escape, the scattered emeralds, the precisely arranged wedding gown, all elements in a carefully orchestrated performance." He paused, his dark eyes moving from face to face, noting the varying degrees of tension his words had produced. But like all performances, this one has left traces of its preparation. The bent hairpin speaks of locks manipulated, the slow clock of time deliberately distorted, and the missing pistol. That suggests our drama may not yet have reached its final act. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears and barely contained secrets. Somewhere among the assembled company, a clever mind was beginning to realize that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had already begun to perceive the pattern hidden beneath the chaos of clues and contradictions. The psychological game had moved beyond mere observation into active confrontation, and the true nature of the crime at Ashworth Park was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows of deception that had concealed it. The evening meal at Ashworth Park carried the weight of unspoken accusations, each course served with a side of barely concealed tension. Poirot, observing from his position at the Dowager Lady Ashworth's right hand, noted how the simple act of dining had become a psychological battlefield where every gesture carried significance. The Philippe Dubois revelation. The correspondence that so distressed Lady Vivienne yesterday, Poirot began conversationally as the soup was served, mentioned a certain Philippe Dubois. Perhaps someone might enlighten us as to this gentleman's significance. The effect was immediate and telling. Miss Cordelia Fairfax's spoon clattered against her bowl, while Mrs. Blackwood's sharp intake of breath was audible across the suddenly silent dining room. Captain James's knuckles whitened as he gripped his wine-glass with military precision, and Lord Edmund's carefully maintained composure showed its first genuine crack. Philippe Dubois was an acquaintance from Vivienne's time in Paris, Edmund said finally, his voice carrying the forced casualness of a man discussing the weather while standing in a hurricane. "An artist, I believe. Nothing of consequence. But the telegram that arrived yesterday suggests otherwise, does it not?" Poirot's voice remained gentle, but his dark eyes missed nothing. "A passing acquaintance rarely requires urgent communication on the eve of a wedding." Mrs. Blackwood, her usual sharp composure finally fracturing, set down her wine-glass with deliberate precision. Philippe Dubois was Lady Vivienne's lover during her sojourn in Paris, Monsieur Poirot. A passionate affair that she believed was concluded when she returned to England and accepted Lord Edmund's proposal. The revelation transformed the atmosphere completely. Miss Cordelia, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, provided the crucial details that had been weighing on her conscience. The telegram begged her to meet him one final time. He had come to England, Monsieur Poirot. He could not bear to see her marry another when their love remained unresolved. The Night Watch. Poirot retired early that evening, expressing the fatigue of a traveler whose motor-car troubles had led to an unexpectedly complex day. But to Inspector Bradshaw alone he murmured, The Blue Suite will receive a visitor tonight. We shall not keep them waiting." By 11 o'clock, the house had settled into an uneasy quiet. Poirot positioned himself in the inspector in the dressing room adjoining the Blue Suite, with the connecting door left slightly ajar. The wedding gown gleamed faintly in the moonlight. The gossamer curtains breathed with the night air, and the mantel clock continued its deliberate deception, ticking 8 minutes behind true time. The faint metallic whisper at the lock came just as Poirot had predicted. The latch yielded without resistance, evidence of the bent hairpin's earlier work. A figure in a long hooded cloak slipped soundlessly through the door, moving with the controlled precision of someone intimately familiar with the room's layout. "Observe, Inspector," Poirot breathed, his voice barely audible. "The first action is not to search, but to arrange. The right curtain, adjusted by precisely 2 inches. The instinct for order betrays the mind that planned this disorder." The intruder moved to the mantel clock, touching it with the tenderness of someone greeting an old friend, making minute adjustments to ensure its continued 8-minute delay. Then, kneeling at the grate, the figure used the poker to reach behind a loose fire brick, retrieving a small oilskin packet with the assurance of prior knowledge. The confrontation. "If you please," Poirot said conversationally, his voice carrying clearly across the moonlit room. "The hour for tidying has passed." The hooded figure froze, then turned with surprising composure rather than panic. The gloved hand closed protectively over the oilskin packet, while the other sought the door, only to find Inspector Bradshaw blocking the exit. Without hesitation, the intruder moved to the French doors, which flew open to reveal the balcony bathed in pale moonlight. Before either man could react, the cloaked figure was over the balustrade, finding the gargoyle's back with practiced ease and descending with the fluid confidence of someone who had rehearsed this exact route. "Do not pursue," Poirot cautioned as Bradshaw moved toward the balcony. "The fox runs to its earth. We shall learn more from observing than from chasing." The shot in the dark. A sharp crack split the night air, the unmistakable report of a pistol. The shot came from the direction of the rose garden, followed immediately by a woman's cry of alarm. By the time Poirot and Bradshaw reached the terrace, the household was emerging in various states of undress and agitation. Colonel Pemberton stood rigid near the east entrance, his sleeve torn and an angry graze marking his upper arm. "A cowardly attack," he declared, though his eyes held something beyond mere outrage. "I was crossing to check the grounds when the shot rang out." Poirot examined the bullet's mark on the stone terrace, deliberately high, meant to warn rather than kill. Curious, is it not, to waste precious ammunition on theater, unless, of course, the theater serves a specific purpose. Mrs. Blackwood, disheveled for perhaps the first time in her adult life, pointed toward the folly. "Someone fled in that direction. A dark cloak, definitely. I saw the hem clearly in the moonlight." Captain James emerged from the shadow of the clipped yews, his soldiers bearing intact despite the circumstances. "I heard the shot from the south lawn. Whoever fired knows these grounds intimately." His eyes found the gargoyle with unconscious familiarity. The hidden evidence. Returning to the Blue Suite while Bradshaw organized a search of the grounds, Poirot examined the fireplace with scientific precision. The loose fire brick showed fresh scrape marks, and a thin trail of soot on the Persian carpet told its story. Most significantly, wedged deep in the crack was a fragment of scorched paper bearing the ghost of a wax seal shaped like a fleur-de-lis. He pocketed the evidence without drawing attention to it, then moved to examine the balcony rail where a faint smudge remained from a gloved palm. But it was the scent that lingered in the night air that proved most revealing. Oak moss and violet, distinctly French and unmistakably expensive. Near dawn, a footman discovered a note pinned to Colonel Pemberton's door. "Do not seek me. I go of my own will. V.A." The handwriting was firm, but Poirot's trained eye detected the minute hesitation before the V's downstroke and the forward lean of the A that suggested haste or forgery. The tightening web. As breakfast was served to a thoroughly unsettled household, Poirot assembled the pieces of his psychological puzzle. The Philippe Dubois connection provided motive for elopement, but the missing pistol suggested darker possibilities. The oilskin packet, retrieved with such care, contained secrets that someone was willing to risk exposure to obtain. The locked room was indeed theatre, he observed to Inspector Bradshaw of a coffee, but theatre designed not to conceal a simple elopement, but something far more complex. The bride who vanished may have done so not from love, but from fear. Or perhaps she did not vanish at all, but was made to disappear. The psychological game had evolved beyond mere deduction into something approaching chess, with moves and counter-moves played out in the shadows of Ashworth Park. Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were working furiously to untangle a web that grew more complex with each revelation, where the missing bride was perhaps the least of the mysteries that demanded solution. The morning brought new questions rather than answers, and somewhere among the assembled suspects, a clever mind was beginning to realize that their carefully constructed deception was unraveling thread by thread under the persistent attentions of the small Belgian detective whose understanding of human nature made him far more dangerous than any conventional investigation. The morning light cast long shadows across the village square as Poirot made his methodical way to the post office, Inspector Bradshaw trailing behind with the resigned air of a man learning to appreciate continental methods of investigation. The small Belgian detective's approach to gathering evidence extended far beyond the confines of Ashworth Park, recognizing that truth often lay hidden in the mundane details of daily life. The telegraph office. Revelation. Miss Cribbins, the postmistress whose spectacles reflected 30 years of careful observation, proved an invaluable witness to the previous day's communications. Her memory, precise as her ledger entries, provided crucial details that shattered one of the case's fundamental assumptions. The reply telegram to Paris was indeed sent from Ashworth Park yesterday afternoon, she confirmed, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses with bureaucratic precision. But it was not delivered by Lady Vivian herself, as some have suggested. The message came through Mr. Hargreaves, the chauffeur, at precisely 5:20. Poirot's dark eyes sharpened with interest. And the message itself, mademoiselle? Brief and to the point. Cannot meet today. Urgent complications. Will write. V. Paid for immediate transmission to Monsieur Philippe Dubois in Paris. She paused, her professional discretion warring with curiosity. Most irregular to send such a personal message through a servant, if you ask me. The revelation struck at the heart of Mrs. Blackwood's earlier testimony. Either the sharp-tongued woman had been deliberately deceiving them about Lady Vivian's personal delivery of the message, or she herself had been the victim of a more elaborate deception. The station porter's memory. Their inquiry at the village station yielded equally significant intelligence. The elderly porter, whose decades of watching arrivals and departures had trained him to notice the unusual, recalled no lady in a grey velvet cloak boarding the late train to London. "I'd have remembered such a thing, sir, what with the wedding preparations and all the talk in the village," he assured Poirot with the confidence of a man whose livelihood depended upon attention to detail. There was a gentleman by the late train, though, hat pulled low, moved with military bearing. Smelled of foreign tobacco, he did. Turkish, perhaps, or something with spices. The description aligned perfectly with Captain James Ashworth's known preferences, adding another layer of complexity to the evening's mysterious activities. The handwriting deception. Returning to Ashworth Park, Poirot employed one of his most subtle investigative techniques. Under the guise of collecting autographs as a continental curiosity, he obtained handwriting samples from each member of the household. The exercise, presented as harmless eccentricity, revealed crucial evidence about the mysterious suicide note that had appeared on Colonel Pemberton's door. Lord Edmund's signature showed the most telling characteristics, a barely perceptible hesitation before the initial downstroke. followed by a forward lean that suggested haste or anxiety. When compared to the suicide note allegedly written by Lady Vivian, the similarities in pressure and rhythm were unmistakable to Poirot's trained eye. "The human hand, Inspector," Poirot observed as they examined the samples in private, "it cannot lie as convincingly as the human tongue. This note bears all the hallmarks of careful forgery, too perfect in its imitation, yet betraying the forger's own nervous habits in its execution." The oilskin packet's secrets. The packet, retrieved from the Blue Suite fireplace, proved to contain documents far more significant than love letters or simple correspondence. Wrapped in oiled silk were architectural plans for a substantial addition to Ashworth Park, detailed financial ledgers spanning several decades, and most significantly, a bond certificate dated nearly 50 years prior, made out to one Lucille Dubois for a considerable sum. The ledgers painted a picture of the Ashworth family finances that contradicted their outward display of prosperity. Lord Edmund's unfortunate investments were revealed as catastrophic losses that had consumed much of the family's liquid assets. The bond certificate, if legitimate, represented a debt that had been carefully concealed within the family for generations. "Observe, Inspector," Poirot murmured, examining the yellow document through his magnifying glass. "The surname Dubois appears not only in our romantic correspondence, but in the very foundations of the Ashworth family's financial obligations. Hercule Poirot does not believe in such coincidences." The psychological web tightens. Armed with this new intelligence, Poirot began applying more direct pressure to the assembled suspects, watching for the telltale reactions that would reveal guilt or complicity. His approach remained characteristically indirect, but the implications of his observations were unmistakable. To Colonel Pemberton he remarked casually, "The bond certificate for Lucille Dubois, such an unusual name to appear in English financial documents. Perhaps someone with military experience in France might recognize its significance." The colonel's reaction was immediate and telling. His weathered features tightened and his gaze flickered away from the document with unmistakable recognition. "Many French names appeared in military records during the war, Monsieur Poirot. I cannot be expected to remember them all." With Captain James, Poirot's approach was more oblique. "The station porter recalls a gentleman with a taste for Turkish tobacco, boarding the late train yesterday. A curious detail given that such preferences are relatively uncommon in this part of England." The captain's military composure cracked slightly. "Many men acquired exotic tastes during foreign service, Monsieur Poirot. It proves nothing. The family secret unveiled." Mrs. Blackwood, when confronted with the evidence of the chauffeur's telegram delivery, finally revealed the deeper truth that had been weighing on her conscience. Her network of correspondences extended far beyond social gossip into the realm of family secrets that stretched back generations. "Lucille Dubois was Philippe's grandmother," she admitted, her sharp composure finally cracking under the weight of concealed knowledge. "She was Lord Edmund's grandfather's companion during his time in Paris. The bond represents not just a financial obligation, but acknowledgement of a natural child, Philippe's father, who was never officially recognized by the Ashworth family." The revelation transformed the entire complexion of the case. Philippe Dubois had not come to England as a romantic rival, but as a legitimate heir seeking recognition of his family's claim to a portion of the Ashworth estate. Lady Vivian's distress upon receiving his correspondence was not romantic confusion, but the realization that her marriage would complicate an already tangled web of family obligations and financial liabilities. The missing bride's true fate. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Ashworth Park, Poirot pieced together the psychological puzzle that had been concealed beneath layers of romantic misdirection. The locked room mystery, the scattered emeralds, the precisely arranged wedding gown, all had been elements in an elaborate deception designed not to conceal an elopement, but to hide a far more calculated crime. "The bride who vanished, Inspector," Poirot announced to the assembled household as evening approached, "did not flee from love or fear. She was removed from the equation by someone who understood that her marriage to Lord Edmund would legally complicate the resolution of the Dubois family claim." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears and barely contained secrets. Somewhere among the assembled suspects, a clever mind was beginning to realize that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had already begun to perceive the pattern hidden beneath the chaos of clues and contradictions. The psychological game had evolved beyond mere investigation into active confrontation, and the true nature of the crime at Ashworth Park was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows of deception that had concealed it. The missing bride was not a romantic heroine, fleeing to her lover's arms, but a victim of calculated greed disguised as impossible mystery. As night fell over the estate, Poirot prepared for the final confrontation that would expose not just a killer, but a conspiracy that reached back through generations of carefully concealed family secrets and financial obligations that someone had been willing to commit murder to protect. The morning brought an unexpected visitor to the village inn, though his arrival had been anticipated by one person alone. Hercule Poirot found Philippe Dubois in the private parlour, a man whose dignified bearing and intelligent eyes immediately dispelled any notion of the romantic adventurer that others had imagined him to be. The legitimate Clément. Philippe Dubois rose as Poirot entered, extending his hand with the courtesy of a gentleman who had travelled far for justice rather than romance. His first words, spoken in careful English with only the faintest trace of accent, revealed the true nature of his mission. "Monsieur Poirot, I'm grateful you agreed to meet with me. I fear my correspondence has been misinterpreted by the Ashworth family. I came to England not to steal a bride, but to claim recognition of my family's legitimate heritage." The documents Philippe produced were meticulously organized and professionally authenticated. Photographic copies of letters written by the late Lord Ashworth to Lucille Dubois, acknowledging their son and promising financial provision. Legal opinions from Parisian solicitors confirming the validity of the bond certificate. Bank records showing decades of ignored correspondence seeking reasonable settlement. "I attempted to arrange a civilized discussion through proper channels," Philippe explained, his composure betraying only the slightest frustration. "Letters to Lord Edmund, formal requests through Colonel Pemberton as Lady Vivian's guardian. Each inquiry met with silence or evasion." Poirot studied the young man with growing respect. "And the urgent telegram requesting a meeting before the wedding?" A final attempt at honourable resolution. "I feared that once the marriage was consummated and legal complications arose, any discussion would become impossible. I asked only for 30 minutes of Lady Vivian's time in daylight, with witnesses, if she preferred." The intercepted communication. The revelation that Philippe had never received the telegram allegedly sent by Lady Vivian proved illuminating. Someone had deliberately prevented the meeting while using its apparent rejection to paint Philippe as a spurned lover growing increasingly desperate. "I was already aboard the boat train when this supposed reply was sent," Philippe confirmed. "Someone wished to ensure that Lady Vivian and I never spoke directly, while simultaneously creating evidence of my romantic pursuit." Poirot's expression grew grave. "Monsieur Dubois, I fear you have walked into a web of deception far more dangerous than you realize. Someone has been using your legitimate claim as cover for crimes considerably more serious than financial fraud." The arranged meeting. Despite Poirot's warnings, Philippe insisted on attempting one final, direct appeal to the Ashworth family. The Belgian detective reluctantly agreed to arrange a meeting at the estate's Old Folly, a location sufficiently private to avoid public scandal while providing the open discussion Philippe sought. "You will not go alone," Poirot insisted, his tone brooking no argument. "And you will carry no weapons, make no threats, offer no ultimatums. This must be conducted with absolute propriety, or it will be used against you." The message Poirot sent to Ashworth Park was deliberately vague, mentioning only that the gentleman from Paris wishes to discuss a family matter of mutual interest and requesting the presence of Lord Edmund and Colonel Pemberton at 4 o'clock. The Trap Springs. At 3:30, Inspector Bradshaw positioned himself in the concealing shadows of the ancient yews surrounding the folly, while Poirot remained at a discreet distance. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the estate grounds, creating a scene that might have been peaceful under different circumstances. Philippe arrived precisely on time, carrying only a leather portfolio containing his documents. His bearing remained dignified despite the obvious tension, and he waited patiently in the Folly's arched entrance for the Ashworth representatives to appear. The sound of approaching footsteps came from the expected direction, but something in their rhythm struck Poirot as wrong. Too measured, too deliberate, the gait of someone approaching not for negotiation, but for confrontation. The fatal encounter. The figure that emerged from the garden path wore the grey velvet cloak that had become central to the mystery, hood drawn up despite the afternoon warmth. The familiar scent of oak moss and violet perfume drifted on the breeze, but beneath it Poirot detected something else, the metallic tang of gun oil and nervous perspiration. "Monsieur Dubois?" The voice was muffled by the hood, deliberately disguised, but Philippe stepped forward with cautious courtesy. "I am he. Are you authorized to speak for the Ashworth family?" The response came not in words, but in the sharp crack of a pistol fired at close range. Philippe staggered backward, his hand instinctively pressing to his chest where a dark stain was already spreading across his white shirt. He tried to speak, perhaps to ask why, but the words died with him as he collapsed against the Folly's ancient stones. The methodical investigation. Poirot's examination of the crime scene revealed the same obsessive attention to detail that had characterized the Blue Suite staging. The killer had positioned themselves with military precision, fired from an elevation that ensured a clean kill, and arranged the scene to suggest a romantic confrontation's gone wrong. "Observe, Inspector," Poirot murmured, kneeling beside the body. "The powder burns indicate a shot fired from approximately 3 feet. Close enough for certainty, distant enough to avoid blood spatter on the killer's clothing. This was executed with professional competence." The grey velvet cloak lay abandoned near the Folly's entrance, but its positioning struck Poirot as theatrical rather than accidental. A long thread caught on a thorn, a deliberate scuff mark in the gravel, even a faint impression in the soft earth, all carefully placed to suggest hasty flight, while actually providing false evidence. The psychological web tightens. Returning to Ashworth Park with news of Philippe's murder, Poirot watched the assembled household's reactions with scientific precision. Lord Edmund's shock appeared genuine, but his immediate concern for how the scandal might affect the family's reputation revealed telling priorities. Captain James received the news with military stoicism, though his eyes flickered toward the windows overlooking the Folly's direction. Colonel Pemberton's reaction proved most interesting, not surprise, but resignation, as if he had been expecting this development. "Tragic," he muttered, "but perhaps inevitable. These foreign entanglements rarely end well." Mrs. Blackwood's sharp features registered something approaching satisfaction, while Miss Cordelia's renewed tears seemed directed more toward her own fears than grief for a man she had never met. "The missing pistol from Lord Edmund's study," Poirot announced quietly, "has likely found its purpose. But the hand that fired it remains to be identified." The tightening noose. As evening approached, Poirot began applying more direct psychological pressure to each suspect, watching for the telltale signs of guilt or complicity. His approach remained characteristically indirect, but the implications were unmistakable. "The grey velvet cloak," he observed to the assembled company, "carries the distinctive scent of French perfume. curious as it was supposedly Lady Vivian's travelling garment. Yet she preferred English lavender water to continental fragrances. He paused, allowing the observation to sink in. Someone has been using this cloak as a theatrical prop, appearing in it to create specific impressions while concealing their true identity. The question remains, who among us has access to such exotic perfumes and the knowledge to use them convincingly? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations and barely concealed fears. Somewhere among the assembled suspects, a clever mind was beginning to realize that their elaborate deception was unraveling thread by thread under the persistent attention of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. The psychological game had evolved beyond mere investigation into active confrontation, with Philippe Dubois' murder serving as a grim reminder that the stakes had risen far beyond financial fraud or romantic scandal. Someone was willing to kill repeatedly to protect their secrets, and Poirot knew that until the full truth was revealed, no one at Ashworth Park was truly safe. The missing bride remained missing, but her fate was now inextricably linked to that of the murdered Frenchman whose only crime had been seeking recognition of his family's legitimate heritage. The web of deception that had begun with a locked room mystery was revealing itself as something far more sinister, a conspiracy that reached back through generations and forward into murder. The dawn light filtering through the tall windows of Ashworth Park found Hercule Poirot in the library, methodically arranging evidence with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate. The small Belgian detective's dark eyes held the satisfaction of a man whose little grey cells had finally begun to perceive the complete pattern hidden beneath layers of calculated deception. The decoy revealed. Inspector Bradshaw watched with growing fascination as Poirot produced the oilskin packet that had been retrieved from the blue suite fireplace the previous night. With deliberate ceremony, he unwrapped the weathered silk to reveal not the precious documents everyone expected, but merely blank papers and an empty envelope. "A decoy, mon ami," Poirot explained, his mustache twitching with satisfaction. What our midnight visitor retrieved was the wrapping only. I had, earlier that afternoon, transferred the genuine contents to a safer location. The fragment of fleur-de-lis wax I left behind was intended for the conscience of one who would recognize its significance. The implications were staggering. Someone had risked exposure to retrieve what they believed were crucial documents, only to discover they had been outmaneuvered by the Belgian detective's superior strategy. More importantly, their willingness to take such risks revealed the desperate nature of their situation. "The person who committed these crimes," Poirot observed, settling into his favorite chair with characteristic precision, "possesses a mind driven by desperate circumstances, but constrained by ingrained habits of order and propriety." They assumed their intimate knowledge of Ashworth Park would allow them to manipulate events without detection, yet that same intimacy has left traces that reveal their identity to one who knows how to read them. The systematic investigation. Poirot's morning interviews followed his methodical approach to psychological detection, each conversation building upon the last like stones in a carefully constructed wall of evidence. His questions appeared casual, almost conversational, yet each was designed to elicit specific information that would either confirm or refute his growing theory. Ethel Marsh, summoned once again to discuss the intimate details of household management, provided crucial intelligence about perfumes and personal items. "Her ladyship preferred English lavender water, sir, never the continental fragrances. Miss Fairfax uses simple violet water, and the dowager favors traditional cologne. But Mrs. Blackwood, she has that strong French scent, oak moss and violet, that makes the maid sneeze when she passes." More significantly, the maid revealed details about the grey velvet cloak that had become central to the mystery. "Mrs. Blackwood had me brush it 2 days ago, sir. Said Lady Vivian wanted it freshened for travelling. And the steel pins, I keep them in a tray by the blue suite dressing table when attending her ladyship." Anyone with access could have taken one. Jarvis, the butler, provided additional crucial details about access and security. His list of master keys revealed only 3. His own, Mrs. Pemberton's, and one held by Colonel Pemberton, by arrangement, sir, as guardian to her ladyship. The revelation that Colonel Pemberton possessed unrestricted access to every room in the house added another significant piece to Poirot's growing understanding. The psychological trap. With characteristic cunning, Poirot employed one of his most effective investigative techniques, the strategic use of false information to provoke revealing reactions. He gathered the household in the drawing room and announced, with a mildness that fooled no one, that the missing emeralds had been traced to a London broker who would shortly arrive to identify the seller. "He brings also a particular detail about the settings," Poirot added, watching faces with scientific precision, something only the person who removed them would know. The announcement was completely fabricated, but the reactions it produced were genuine and illuminating. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed with interest rather than fear. The dowager's chin lifted in aristocratic disdain. Miss Cordelia swayed as if she might faint, then caught herself with visible effort. Captain James maintained his military composure without the slightest change in expression. Most revealing of all was Lord Edmund's unconscious adjustment of the hearthrug's edge, pulling it into perfect alignment with the grate. The same obsessive need for order that had betrayed itself in the Blue Suite's precisely arranged crime scene. Colonel Pemberton's reaction was equally telling, a hard swallow that suggested genuine fear rather than mere concern. The physical evidence speaks. Poirot's examination of Mrs. Blackwood's quarters revealed the source of the French perfume that had clung to the grey velvet cloak. The cut-glass bottle labelled Parfum Fin de Paris contained the distinctive blend of oak moss and violet that had been detected at multiple crime scenes. Yet when he lifted the stopper, his trained nose detected something more. The scent had been deliberately diluted with English lavender water. "Someone wished to create the impression of continental sophistication," he observed to Inspector Bradshaw, while maintaining plausible deniability. "A person who understood that scent creates memory, but who lacked confidence in their ability to maintain the deception under close scrutiny." His discovery of a small jeweler's tool in the rose garden provided the final piece of physical evidence. No longer than a match, its head stained with verdigris, it was precisely the type used to ease prongs from precious stones without damaging the settings. The tool's presence confirmed that the emerald theft had been conducted with professional expertise, not the desperate haste of a panicked servant. The false confession. The afternoon brought what appeared to be a breakthrough when Miss Cordelia Fairfax was found weeping hysterically in the conservatory, claiming responsibility for Philippe Dubois' murder. Her confession seemed to provide the resolution that Inspector Bradshaw desperately sought. "I shot him," she sobbed, her words barely coherent through her tears. "The villain who stole Vivienne away. I found the pistol, I don't know where it came from, and I shot him for her sake." Yet Poirot's gentle but relentless questioning quickly revealed the confession's fundamental flaws. Cordelia had never met Philippe Dubois, and could not explain how she had recognized him as the supposed villain. Her story unraveled under scrutiny, revealing itself as the desperate attempt of a grief-stricken young woman to make sense of chaos by accepting blame she did not deserve. "The little grey cells, they protest most vigorously against such a narrative," Poirot observed to Bradshaw after dismissing the false confession. "This is not a crime of passion committed by a distressed maiden, but a calculated conspiracy executed with military precision and concealed with theatrical sophistication." The mounting pressure. As evening approached, Poirot began applying more direct psychological pressure to each suspect, watching for the telltale signs of guilt that would confirm his deductions. His approach remained characteristically indirect, but the implications of his observations were unmistakable. To Captain James he remarked casually, the station porter's memory of a gentleman with Turkish tobacco, preferences boarding the late train. Such details tend to linger in the minds of observant men. Military training, perhaps, creates habits of notice that extend beyond the battlefield. With Lord Edmund, his approach was more oblique. The human hand reveals character through unconscious actions, the way one arranges objects, adjusts details, seeks order even in moments of crisis. Such habits, once established, become as distinctive as fingerprints to those who know how to read them. Colonel Pemberton received the most pointed observation. The grey velvet cloak carries more than French perfume, mon colonel. It carries the weight of decisions made in desperation, actions taken to preserve honor that paradoxically destroyed it. The bond certificate for Lucille Dubois represents not merely financial obligation, but the recognition that some debts cannot be paid with money alone. The web tightens. As the household retired for what many suspected might be their last peaceful night at Ashworth Park, Poirot remained in the library, surrounded by the evidence that would soon expose a conspiracy reaching back through generations. The locked room mystery, the missing bride, the murdered Frenchman, all were elements in a carefully orchestrated deception designed to conceal crimes far more serious than romantic scandal. "Tomorrow," he murmured to Inspector Bradshaw, "we shall gather them all to hear a story. It will be a tale of order masquerading as chaos, of love used as a mask for greed, and of a family so afraid of scandal that they embraced a scandal far worse than any they sought to avoid." The psychological game had reached its crucial phase, with each player positioned for the final moves that would expose not merely a killer, but a web of deception that had transformed a wedding day into a carefully planned execution disguised as impossible mystery. Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had perceived the pattern at last, and justice, delayed but not denied, was finally prepared to reveal itself in all its terrible clarity. The morning would bring the final confrontation, and with it, the complete unraveling of a conspiracy that demonstrated the lengths to which desperate minds would go to preserve the illusion of respectability while committing the most disrespectable acts imaginable. The morning light, filtering through the tall windows of Ashworth Park's drawing room, cast long shadows across what had become an impromptu courtroom. Hercule Poirot stood before the assembled household with the quiet authority of a conductor preparing to direct the final movement of a symphony that had begun with wedding bells and descended into murder. The final gathering. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying that deceptive mildness that those familiar with his methods knew preceded his most devastating revelations. "We gather this morning to witness the conclusion of what has been presented as an impossible mystery. The bride who vanished from a locked room, leaving behind only scattered jewels and unanswered questions." His dark eyes moved systematically across each face, noting the varying degrees of tension his words produced. Lord Edmund sat rigidly in his ancestral chair, his military bearing intact but betrayed by hands that remained too carefully controlled. Captain James maintained his soldier's composure near the window, though his weathered features had taken on the watchful quality of a man expecting attack. Mrs. Blackwood's sharp features were set in aristocratic disdain, while Miss Cordelia dabbed at her eyes with trembling fingers. "But what we have experienced here is not a genuine mystery," Poirot continued, his mustache twitching with professional satisfaction. "It is, rather, an elaborate theatrical production designed to conceal crimes far more serious than a bride's romantic escapade. The locked room, the vanishing lady, the scattered emeralds, all elements in a carefully orchestrated performance that required not one mind, but two, working in perfect collaboration. The locked room deception. Revealed. With methodical precision that would have impressed a Swiss clockmaker, Poirot began dismantling the carefully constructed illusion. He moved to examine the bent steel hairpin, holding it to the morning light like a prosecutor displaying crucial evidence. This humble object tells the first part of our story. Not a tool for arranging hair, but an instrument for persuading reluctant locks to yield their secrets. The slight bend in its shaft bears the mark of pressure applied with specific intent, the work of someone with both the skill and the intimate knowledge necessary to manipulate the blue suite's ancient mechanism. He paused at the mantel, his fingers touching the edge of the Persian carpet with the same precision that had characterized every crime scene detail. But the true genius of this deception lay not in the lock manipulation, but in the manipulation of time itself. The mantel clock in the blue suite has run 8 minutes slow for years, a domestic annoyance that became the cornerstone of an elaborate alibi. Inspector Bradshaw leaned forward with professional interest as Poirot continued his methodical revelation. When Mrs. Pemberton testified that she secured the room at 11 o'clock, the actual time was 11:08. 8 crucial minutes that transformed an impossible locked room mystery into a simple matter of timing and access. Someone with a master key could enter, arrange the scene with meticulous precision, and depart, all while maintaining the illusion that Lady Vivian had vanished from within. The psychology of collaboration. The wedding gown, Poirot observed, his voice taking on the gentle reproach of a disappointed teacher, was arranged not by a fleeing bride, but by someone whose obsession with order betrayed them even in the commission of murder. Every fold precisely positioned, every detail attended to with the care of a museum curator. This is not the work of panic, mes amis, but of a mind that cannot tolerate disorder, even when disorder would serve its purposes better. His gaze fixed on Lord Edmund, whose unconscious adjustment of a picture frame had not escaped the detective's notice. The scattered emerald settings tell a similar story. Not wrenched away by desperate hands, but carefully removed with professional expertise, then positioned to suggest hasty theft. The raw stones planted on poor Annie Blake were merely misdirection, crude theater designed to provide a convenient culprit while the real perpetrator remained above suspicion. Poirot moved to the French doors, his hands gripping the frame as he gazed toward the rose garden where so much of the deception had been staged. But such elaborate planning required more than meticulous attention to detail. It required physical capability, military precision, and the ability to execute under pressure. The gargoyle that provided access to the blue suite balcony, the perfect shot that killed Philippe Dubois, the systematic removal of evidence, these were not the actions of a drawing-room strategist, but of a man trained in the arts of war. The financial motive. Exposed. The Philippe Dubois matter, Poirot announced, turning to face the assembled company with the gravity of a judge pronouncing sentence, was never about romantic rivalry. Monsieur Dubois came to England as a legitimate heir, bearing documents that proved his family's claim to a significant portion of the Ashworth estate. The bond certificate for Lucille Dubois, concealed for generations, represented not merely financial obligation, but the exposure of a deception that had been maintained through decades of careful manipulation. He produced the yellowed document, handling it with the reverence due to evidence that had cost 2 lives. Lord Edmund's catastrophic financial losses, disguised as unfortunate investments, had consumed the family's liquid assets. Lady Vivian's inheritance represented salvation, but only if the Dubois claim could be eliminated permanently. Colonel Pemberton's weathered features had gone pale, and Poirot noted the detail with professional satisfaction. The colonel, as Lady Vivian's guardian, possessed not only intimate knowledge of her financial affairs, but also the keys that provided unrestricted access to every room in the house. His cooperation, willing or coerced, was essential to the conspiracy's success. The systematic murders. Lady Vivian Ashworth. Poirot announced with quiet authority that silenced even the whisper of morning breeze through the windows, did not vanish from the blue suite because she was never there to vanish. She was murdered during the early hours of the wedding morning, not by a stranger or a jealous rival, but by those she trusted most completely. The gasps that greeted this revelation were genuine, but Poirot observed with professional interest that Lord Edmund showed no surprise, only the resigned acceptance of a chess player who had finally been checkmated. The method was as simple as it was effective. Lady Vivian was summoned from her room under some pretext, perhaps a last-minute detail requiring her attention, or news of Philippe Dubois that demanded immediate consultation. Once in the hands of her killers, she was quickly silenced and her body concealed in the old priest hole behind the Blue Suite's paneling, a hiding place known only to family members and revealed in architectural plans that I discovered among the Colonel's papers. Poirot's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty as he continued. The grey velvet cloak served multiple purposes in this deception. Scented with Mrs. Blackwood's distinctive French perfume, borrowed without her knowledge, it provided both disguise and misdirection. The killer could appear as Lady Vivian to casual observers while simultaneously creating false evidence of continental romantic intrigue. The Philippe Dubois execution. The murder of Philippe Dubois was equally calculated, Poirot observed, his dark eyes fixing on Captain James with uncomfortable intensity. The missing pistol from Lord Edmund's study was not taken for desperate search, but for premeditated execution. The meeting at the Folly was arranged not for negotiation, but for elimination of the only witness who could expose decades of financial fraud. Captain James's military composure showed its first crack, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that Poirot noted with satisfaction. The shot that killed Monsieur Dubois was fired with military precision, not the wild aim of an emotional woman, but the controlled accuracy of a trained soldier. The grey velvet cloak provided both concealment and false evidence, while the staged romantic confrontation deflected suspicion from the true motive. The web of evidence. Inspector Bradshaw stepped forward with a collection of physical evidence that had been systematically gathered throughout Poirot's investigation. The perfume traces on the cloak matched samples from Mrs. Blackwood's quarters, though she was unaware of their theft. The jeweller's tool found in the rose garden bears fingerprints from both Lord Edmund and Captain James. Most significantly, architectural plans in Colonel Pemberton's possession revealed the exact location of the priest hole where Lady Vivian's body was concealed. Poirot nodded with satisfaction as each piece of evidence was presented. The human hand, Inspector, cannot lie as convincingly as the human tongue. Lord Edmund's handwriting samples revealed the same nervous hesitation found in the forged suicide note. Captain James's familiarity with the estate's hidden passages betrayed itself in his unconscious navigation during our investigations. Even their collaboration was revealed through small details, the way Lord Edmund instinctively adjusted objects to perfect order, while Captain James automatically assessed tactical advantages. The final confrontation. Lord Edmund Ashworth and Captain James Ashworth. Poirot announced with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "You stand accused of the premeditated murders of Lady Vivian Ashworth and Philippe Dubois. Your conspiracy was born of financial desperation and executed with military precision, but it was betrayed by the very attention to detail that you believed would ensure its success." The silence that followed was broken by Lord Edmund's hollow laugh, a sound devoid of humor or hope. "Clever, Monsieur Poirot, very clever indeed, but you understand nothing of honor, of duty, of the obligations that bind a man to preserve what generations have built." "I understand," Poirot replied with gentle firmness, "that no obligation justifies the murder of an innocent woman whose only crime was possessing a conscience. Lady Vivian threatened to postpone the wedding until the Dubois matter could be honorably resolved, a delay that would have exposed your financial deceptions and made her inheritance legally complicated. So you eliminated her, staged an elaborate disappearance, and murdered the man whose only crime was seeking justice for his family." Captain James finally spoke, his voice carrying the weary acceptance of a soldier who had fought his last battle. "She would have destroyed everything, Poirot, everything our family built, everything we fought to preserve. The Dubois claim would have stripped away half the estate, left us with nothing but debts and scandal. And so you chose a different scandal, Poirot observed with quiet reproach. Murder disguised as mystery, conspiracy masked as romance. But the little grey cells, messieurs, they perceive patterns that the guilty mind believes are invisible. Your need for order, your military training, your intimate knowledge of the estate, all became signatures that identified you as surely as fingerprints. Justice served. As Inspector Bradshaw moved to make the arrests, Lord Edmund straightened in his chair with a dignity that his crimes had not entirely destroyed. "We regret the necessity, Monsieur Poirot, but we do not regret the intent. The Ashworth name will survive this scandal, as it has survived others." "The Ashworth name," Poirot replied with the sadness of a man who had seen too much of human nature's darker aspects, "will survive only as a cautionary tale about the price of placing pride above principle, order above justice, and family reputation above human life." As the two brothers were led away, Poirot remained in the drawing-room, surrounded by the elegant furnishings that had witnessed so much deception and death. The locked-room mystery had been solved not through supernatural explanation, but through the methodical application of psychological detection to minds that believed their superior planning could overcome the persistent attention of a small Belgian detective whose understanding of human nature made him far more dangerous than any conventional investigation. The bride who vanished before the vows had not fled to romantic adventure, but had been silenced by those who should have protected her. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally revealed itself in all its terrible clarity, proving once again that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells could penetrate even the most elaborate deceptions when human lives hung in the balance. The morning sun, which should have illuminated a wedding celebration, instead cast its light on the resolution of a tragedy that demonstrated the lengths to which desperate minds would go to preserve illusions of respectability while committing the most disrespectable acts imaginable. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Ashworth Park carried with it the weight of revelation, and the promise of justice finally served. The great house, which had witnessed such elaborate deceptions and tragic revelations, now seemed to exhale a collective sigh as the truth settled into its ancient stones like dust after a violent storm. The priest Hole's terrible secret. Under Poirot's careful direction, Inspector Bradshaw's men worked with reverent precision to open the concealed chamber behind the blue suite's paneling. The priest Hole, a relic from centuries past when religious persecution had made such hiding places necessary for survival, had been transformed into a tomb by those who should have been protectors. Lady Vivian Ashworth lay within, arranged with that same terrible precision that had characterized every aspect of the conspiracy. Her wedding dress, meant to symbolize joy and new beginnings, had become a shroud. The grey velvet traveling cloak, scented with Mrs. Blackwood's distinctive French perfume, wrapped her like a theatrical costume in death's final performance. "She was kind," Ethel Marsh whispered helplessly, as the body was borne past, her voice breaking with the weight of loss. As gentle as a spring morning she was. Poirot lifted his hat in respectful silence, his dark eyes reflecting the sorrow of a man who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for evil. "We will remember her so, mademoiselle. Not by the theatricals of those who wronged her, but by the courage she showed in defending what was right." The medical examiner's findings confirmed what Poirot's little grey cells had already deduced. Lady Vivian had died from a single, calculated blow to the head, delivered with military precision. There had been no struggle, no opportunity for escape. She had been murdered by those she trusted most, silenced because her conscience had made her dangerous to their desperate schemes. The complete confessions. With the physical evidence overwhelming and their elaborate deception finally exposed, both Lord Edmund and Captain James Ashworth provided full confessions that revealed the conspiracy's true scope. Their collaboration had been born of financial desperation and executed with the methodical precision that had nearly made it succeed. Colonel Pemberton, faced with irrefutable proof of his complicity, collapsed under the weight of his concealed guilt. His confession, delivered in the library, where so many of the conspiracy's details had been planned, painted a picture of reluctant participation that had gradually escalated into active collaboration. "Lord Edmund came to me 6 months ago," he admitted, his military bearing finally cracking under the strain. The family's finances were in ruins, worse than anyone suspected. The Dubois correspondence had been arriving for years, each letter more insistent than the last. When Philippe announced his intention to visit England, everything changed. The colonel's role had been that of enabler rather than architect, providing the master keys and architectural knowledge necessary for the conspiracy's success, while maintaining the illusion of respectability. His reward would have been a substantial portion of Lady Vivian's inheritance, enough to secure his retirement and purchase his silence. "I never intended for murder," he insisted, though his words carried the hollow ring of a man trying to convince himself as much as his interrogators. "Edmund assured me it would be a matter of delay, perhaps a convenient accident during the honeymoon. But when Lady Vivian threatened to postpone the wedding until the Dubois matter could be honorably resolved, they panicked." The innocent victims. Aftermath. The revelation of the conspiracy's true nature had devastating effects on those who had unknowingly participated in its elaborate staging. Mrs. Helena Blackwood, discovering that her distinctive French perfume and sharp social observations had been weaponized against the truth, retreated into a shocked silence that her usually cutting tongue could not penetrate. Poirot found her in the drawing-room, a rare vulnerability etched across features that had never before shown uncertainty. "I cannot believe it, Monsieur Poirot," she confessed, her voice stripped of its usual authority. "That they would use my perfume, my observations, to spin such a monstrous web. I genuinely believed Vivian had eloped with that artist." "Your observations, madame, were invaluable to the investigation," Poirot replied with gentle firmness. "It is not your fault that the guilty twisted them to serve their deception. You observed correctly, but you lacked the complete picture that would have revealed the underlying motive." Miss Cordelia Fairfax, learning that her dearest friend had been murdered while she slept peacefully in the adjoining room, suffered a complete emotional collapse. Her false confession, born of grief and desperate confusion, had been a misguided attempt to protect someone she believed might have committed a crime of passion. "Vivian was going to postpone the wedding," Cordelia revealed through her tears when she finally understood the truth. "She told me the night before. She had received documents that proved Philippe Dubois' claim was legitimate. She wanted to ensure justice was done before she took her vows." Annie Blake, the scullery maid, who had been used as a convenient scapegoat, could scarcely comprehend her vindication. Inspector Bradshaw, awkward in his gentleness, presented her with the magistrate's official clearance and a small purse contributed by the household staff at Poirot's suggestion. "For your mother's medicine," Bradshaw said kindly, "and perhaps for shoes that will not catch in oak trees." Annie's incredulous laugh, the sound of reprieve and hope restored, provided one of the few moments of genuine joy in the aftermath of so much calculated evil. Justice and consequences. The legal machinery moved with inexorable precision once the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. The Crown Prosecutor's Office, armed with overwhelming evidence of premeditated murder, prepared charges that would ensure both Ashworth brothers faced the ultimate penalty. The systematic nature of their crimes, the cold calculation of their methods, and the complete absence of mitigating circumstances made their cases particularly damning. The financial audit revealed the true extent of Lord Edmund's catastrophic losses, which had consumed not only the family's liquid assets, but had mortgaged the estate itself beyond recovery. Lady Vivian's inheritance had represented salvation, but only if the Dubois claim could be permanently eliminated. Philippe Dubois' heirs represented by competent Parisian solicitors, would undoubtedly pursue the legitimate claim that had cost their family member his life. The bond certificate for Lucille Dubois, authenticated by neutral experts, represented a debt that could no longer be concealed or ignored. The Dowager Lady Ashworth, confronted with the complete destruction of her family's reputation, maintained her aristocratic dignity through sheer force of will. "The Ashworth name has survived centuries of scandal," she declared with characteristic determination. "It will survive this as well, though it may take generations to restore what has been lost in a single morning." Poirot's final reflections. As evening approached and preparations for his departure neared completion, Hercule Poirot stood once more in the blue suite where the elaborate deception had been staged. The room, stripped of its theatrical elements and cleansed of its terrible secrets, revealed itself as merely another chamber in an ancient house. Walls that had witnessed centuries of human drama, both noble and sordid. "The human heart," he murmured to the gathering dusk, his voice carrying the weight of professional experience with mankind's darker impulses. "It is like a garden, Inspector. Full of beauty, yes, but also capable of growing the most poisonous weeds. My little grey cells, they merely prune away the falsehoods until the true nature of the plant is revealed." He moved to the French doors, gazing out at the rose garden where so much of the deception had been staged. These men convinced themselves they were preserving honor while destroying it, protecting family while murdering family, maintaining order while creating the most terrible chaos. The locked room was indeed theater, but theater designed not to entertain, but to deceive, not to reveal truth, but to conceal it. Inspector Bradshaw, joining him on the balcony, expressed the gratitude of a man who had learned to appreciate continental methods of investigation. "Without your intervention, Monsieur Poirot, this would have been remembered as an impossible mystery rather than solved as a calculated crime." "Justice delayed," Poirot replied with characteristic precision, "but not denied. The little grey cells, mon ami, they do not rest until truth emerges from even the most elaborate deceptions. Lady Vivienne Ashworth and Philippe Dubois have found their justice, though it came too late to save their lives." The final departure. As Hercule Poirot's repaired motor car appeared in the circular drive of Ashworth Park, he paused for one final survey of the estate that had witnessed such elaborate deceptions and tragic revelations. The great house, which had seemed so elegant and prosperous upon his arrival, now appeared diminished by the weight of its terrible secrets finally exposed. Jarvis announced the vehicle's readiness with ceremonial gravity, while the Dowager requested that Poirot take a final tea before departing. He declined with a bow that somehow conveyed both courtesy and a gentle refusal of further ceremony. In the entrance hall, Ethel Marsh stepped forward uncertainly, unsure whether to curtsy or flee. Poirot spared her the choice. "You were loyal, and you told the truth," he said with quiet kindness. "That is all the law of the heart requires." On the terrace, he paused by the stone balustrade where a gloved palm had once left evidence of guilt. Taking the bent steel hairpin from his pocket, the first whisper from an obstinate lock that had led to the unraveling of the entire conspiracy, he dropped it into the shallow bowl of a stone urn. "There," he said softly to Inspector Bradshaw, who had accompanied him to the entrance. "A small disorder removed. It is the price of loving order, mon brave. One must go into the rooms where it has been abused. But sometimes one sees that order can be mended." As the motor car pulled away from Ashworth Park for the final time, Hercule Poirot reflected on a case that had demonstrated both the depths of human deception and the persistence of truth when pursued with methodical determination. The locked room mystery had been solved not through supernatural explanation, but through the careful application of psychological detection to minds that believed their superior planning could overcome the relentless attention of a small Belgian detective whose understanding of human nature made him far more dangerous than any conventional investigation. In England, he observed to no one in particular, as the great house disappeared behind the trees. They arranged the flowers so perfectly for the ceremony. It is a pity, perhaps, that the vows are sometimes the least examined part. The bride who vanished before the vows would be remembered not as a romantic heroine fleeing to her lover's arms, but as a victim of calculated greed disguised as impossible mystery. Her death, and that of Philippe Dubois, served as grim reminders that justice, however elaborately concealed, would ultimately prevail when pursued by one whose little grey cells could perceive the patterns hidden beneath even the most carefully constructed chaos. The afternoon sun, which should have illuminated a wedding celebration, instead cast its final light on the resolution of a tragedy that demonstrated the terrible price of placing pride above principle, order above justice, and family reputation above human life. The game was over, the players had been revealed, and truth had emerged victorious from the shadows of deception that had concealed it. As Ashworth Park faded into memory behind him, Hercule Poirot arranged his hat, his gloves, and the fold of his coat with characteristic precision, the outward rituals by which he made the world briefly right-sized after witnessing its capacity for such elaborate wrongness. The case of The Bride Who Vanished Before the Vows was closed, but its lessons about human nature would linger long after the legal proceedings had concluded and the scandal had faded from public memory. The September afternoon cast long shadows across the grounds of Ashworth Park as Hercule Poirot made his final preparations for departure. The great house, which had witnessed such elaborate deceptions and tragic revelations, seemed to exhale a collective sigh as the truth settled into its ancient stones like dust after a violent storm. The scales of justice. Inspector Bradshaw joined Poirot on the terrace, carrying the final dispatch from London. "The committal proceedings are concluded, Monsieur Poirot," he announced with the satisfaction of a man who had learned to appreciate continental methods of investigation. "Both Lord Edmund and Captain James will stand trial for murder. The Crown Prosecutor expresses confidence in securing convictions." Poirot nodded gravely, his dark eyes reflecting the weight of justice finally served. "And Colonel Pemberton will turn King's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation has been complete." Bradshaw paused, consulting his notes. "The financial audit reveals debts exceeding £200,000. The estate will be sold to satisfy creditors, with the remainder going to settle the Dubois claim." "Justice," Poirot observed, adjusting his perfectly waxed mustache, "is sometimes slow, but she is thorough, mon ami. The locked room has yielded not only its secrets, but its consequences. The innocent vindicated." The small Belgian detective had insisted on personally ensuring that those wrongly accused or unwittingly involved received proper resolution. Annie Blake, the scullery maid who had been used as a convenient scapegoat, had found employment with a respectable family in the neighboring county. The magistrate's official clearance had restored her reputation, while a small purse contributed by the household staff at Poirot's suggestion had secured her mother's medicine. "It will be clean work, sir, and I'll have a cab," she had written in her careful script, her pride evident even through the formality of ink and paper. Ethel Marsh, Lady Vivian's loyal maid, had accepted a position with a kindly family in Yorkshire. Her testimony had been crucial to the investigation's success, proving that truth often emerged from the observations of those whom the guilty considered beneath notice. "I will remember her ladyship as she was," Ethel had confided during their final meeting, gentle as a spring morning, with courage enough to stand for what was right. The guilty scattered. Mrs. Helena Blackwood had departed Ashworth Park within hours of the arrests, her sharp tongue finally silenced by the realization that her social observations had been weaponized against truth itself. The society columns recorded her retreat to Florence to convalesce from a protracted nervous indisposition. Miss Cordelia Fairfax, shattered by her friend's murder and her own unwitting participation in the conspiracy's misdirection, had withdrawn to a private sanatorium where gentle care might eventually restore what grief and guilt had destroyed. Her false confession, born of desperate confusion, served as a poignant reminder that innocence often suffers alongside guilt in the aftermath of elaborate deceptions. The Dowager Lady Ashworth, her aristocratic dignity intact despite the complete destruction of her family's reputation, had announced her intention to let the park and retire to a modest cottage by the sea. "The roses there are inferior," she had written without apology, "but the wind is honest. I cannot say the same for London." The physical evidence disposed. The Ashworth emeralds, retrieved from their hiding place in the gargoyle's mouth exactly as Poirot had predicted, would be sold to help satisfy the family's crushing debts. The stones themselves, innocent of the evil they had inspired, would find new settings and new owners who might appreciate their beauty without understanding their terrible history. The grey velvet cloak, scented with French perfume and stained with deception, had been destroyed by fire at Poirot's suggestion. Some evidence, he observed, was too tainted by evil to preserve, even for the sake of legal procedure. The bent steel hairpin, that humble instrument which had first whispered of locks manipulated and time distorted, Poirot kept as a reminder that truth often announced itself through the smallest details that larger minds overlooked. Philosophical reflections. As his repaired motor car appeared in the circular drive, Poirot paused for one final survey of the estate that had witnessed such calculated evil disguised as impossible mystery. The great house, which had seemed so elegant and prosperous upon his arrival, now appeared diminished by the weight of its terrible secrets finally exposed. "The human heart," he murmured to Inspector Bradshaw. "It is like a garden, mon ami. Full of beauty, yes, but also capable of growing the most poisonous weeds." These men convinced themselves they were preserving honor while destroying it, protecting family while murdering family, maintaining order while creating the most terrible chaos. He moved to examine one final time the stone balustrade where a gloved palm had once left evidence of guilt. "The locked room was never about the room at all, Inspector. It was about the locks we place upon our own consciences and the keys we refuse to turn even when justice demands it." Letters from the aftermath. In the weeks that followed his return to London, Poirot received correspondence that provided closure to the human elements of the case. The Dowager wrote from her seaside cottage, enclosing a small watercolor miniature of Lady Vivian, tender in the way that only the unguarded hand affords. Poirot placed it on his mantel between a pair of candlesticks he had arranged exactly equidistant. Annie Blake's letter, written in the careful hand of one learning to read and write, announced that she had named her first child Vivian in memory of a mistress whose kindness had been rewarded with calculated evil. "Justice may come slowly, sir," she concluded, "but it comes complete when it finally arrives." From Paris came official notification that Philippe Dubois had been interred with full honors in his family's village cemetery, where a small marble plaque would mark his grave. Poirot, who seldom gave to public appeals, sent quietly to the education of two nephews bearing the name Dubois, asking nothing in return except a promise that they would learn to read ledgers as well as poems. The final accounting. On a grey London morning, Poirot visited the jeweller in Bond Street to witness the final disposition of the emeralds. As their green fire was rendered to figures in a ledger, the proprietor sighed. Such beauty and such mischief. "It is not the fault of the emerald," Poirot replied with gentle firmness, "that the finger which wears it is unworthy." When he left, rain had begun to stipple the pavement with a pattern that satisfied him by its regularity. He turned up his collar an exact degree and walked to the river, where the bridges make a geometry that pleases a mind like his. The case, which had begun with a locked room and a folded dress, ended here as all cases did, in the quiet inventory a man makes with himself. The return to order. That evening, the telephone rang in his flat. It was Hastings, freshly returned from South America, full of accounts in which both the heroism and the fish were larger than life. "You sound in spirits, old man," Hastings concluded. "Anything of note while I was away?" "Only a wedding," Poirot said softly, arranging 3 objects on his desk with characteristic precision. The bent steel hairpin, now inert and respectable. A single emerald setting, empty of its stone but no longer deceitful. And the pressed white petal Miss Fairfax had sent, whitened to near translucence. And a funeral. And the education of 2 boys who will open their letters when they come, not hide them in fireplaces. "Good Lord," Hastings said in bewilderment. "You must tell me everything." "I will tell you what there is to tell, mon ami," Poirot replied, allowing himself the smallest smile. "And I will arrange the flowers while I do so." He replaced the receiver with precise care. Outside, the city resumed its untidy symphony. Inside, the little Belgian restored his order, which is the only victory a man may keep after he has restored justice to others. Epilogue. The bride who had vanished before her vows was remembered not as a romantic heroine fleeing to her lover's arms, but as a victim of calculated greed whose death had exposed a conspiracy reaching back through generations. The locked room had yielded its secrets not to supernatural explanation, but to the methodical application of psychological detection to minds that believed their superior planning could overcome the relentless attention of one whose understanding of human nature made him uniquely dangerous. Justice, delayed but never denied, had emerged victorious from the shadows of deception. The affair at Ashworth Park was concluded, its lessons absorbed, its victims remembered, and its perpetrators consigned to the justice they had sought so desperately to avoid. As Hercule Poirot prepared for sleep, he reflected on a case that had demonstrated both the depths of human deception and the persistence of truth when pursued with methodical determination. The little grey cells, having solved another seemingly impossible puzzle, could rest in the satisfaction of work well done and justice finally served. The locked room mystery of the bride who vanished before the vows would take its place among the solved cases that demonstrated the triumph of methodical detection over calculated deception, a reminder that truth, however deeply buried, would ultimately prevail when pursued by one whose understanding of the human heart made him uniquely qualified to separate illusion from reality. The game was over, the players revealed, and order restored to a world that had briefly forgotten the difference between justice and convenience, between honor and reputation, between the appearance of respectability and its substance.